Okay, let's dive into something truly mind-bending today. Welcome to this explainer. We're going to unpack a fascinating breakdown from our source material on a really radical way of interpreting ancient texts. We're talking about how ancient Gnostic teachings essentially took the traditional biblical narrative and just flipped it entirely upside down. If you've ever wondered how certain mystical traditions arrived at completely opposite conclusions from Orthodox theology, well, this breakdown is going to be incredibly illuminating. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the concept of inverted hermeneutics, then look at the Gnostic view of creation, the inverted Garden of Eden story, and the Gospel of Judas. After that, we'll touch on Gnosticism in modern pop culture, and finally, the biblical defense and warnings against these ideas. Section 1. Inverted hermeneutics, a radical methodology. To truly grasp how these Gnostic texts operate, our source points out that we have to understand their methodology. They applied a very specific, and honestly, highly radical interpretive method to the Old Testament. Let's look at exactly what that means. The source describes this foundational concept as inverted hermeneutics. Now, hermeneutics is basically just a fancy word for how we interpret texts, but in this case, it's an inverted lens. And this is the core engine driving all Gnostic beliefs. According to our source, the Gnostics didn't just disagree with the Old Testament. They read it and then structurally reversed the roles of the heroes and villains, the good and the evil. Before we see that inversion in action, we really need to define Gnosticism itself. It comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. But the source emphasizes this isn't your everyday academic study. We're not talking about reading books here. For the Gnostics, this was about a secret mystical insight. It was pure intuition. It was the deep self-realization that you actually possess a divine spark within yourself, making you equal to the divine. Section 2. Gnostic creation, a bizarre lineage. Let's move to and see how this builds, because this inverted perspective completely reconstructs how the universe was made. Prepare yourselves, because the cosmological lineage our source attributes to Gnostic teachings is, quite frankly, bizarre. Here is the step-by-step Gnostic creation myth exactly as broken down by the source. First, at the very top, the true and ultimate God is actually viewed as an entity representing death. Second, through a series of emanations, a being named Sophia is created. Third, Sophia becomes incredibly frustrated because she cannot truly know the ultimate god of death. And in her anger, she miscarries, creating the entity known as Yahweh. And fourth, because Yahweh is seen as this monstrous, ignorant mistake, Sophia casts him out into total isolation. It's in that lonely isolation, completely ignorant of the higher gods above him, that Yahweh creates the physical universe. So, to the Gnostics, as the source explains, our physical world is essentially a matrix-like trap created by a flawed, foolish entity. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of the inversion. In the traditional view, God is a loving creator who makes a physical universe that is inherently good. But look at it through the Gnostic lens. Yahweh is a monstrous, ignorant creator, which inherently makes the physical world evil, something you need to escape from. The source points out that this philosophy effectively takes the traditional God of the Bible and turns him into the devil. Section 3. The inverted Eden story, altering the narrative. Now, if the creator of the physical world is the bad guy, what in the world happens to the Genesis narrative? Let's take a look. Well, just as the creator was inverted, so is the serpent. The source explains that while traditional theology views the serpent as Satan, the ultimate deceiver who causes humanity's fall, the Gnostic texts frame the serpent as the absolute hero. In their view, the serpent is actually a savior. He's a messenger sent by Sophia to bring illuminating knowledge, or gnosis, down to humanity, to free them from the ignorant creator's trap. The source draws our attention to this very specific message from the serpent: you will be like gods. From the traditional perspective, we all know this as a lie that leads to sin. But from the Gnostic perspective, the source notes that this was the ultimate wonderful invitation. It was Sophia awakening humanity to their hidden divine spark. The Gnostics believed the serpent was absolutely right. Eating the fruit was literally the key to mystical enlightenment. Section 4. The Gospel of Judas, mocking worship. This brings us to a specific ancient text highlighted by the source to show these ideas in practice. Let's examine how the Gospel of Judas portrays these exact same inverted theological themes. The source provides this direct quote from the Gospel of Judas. It sets a scene where Jesus approaches his disciples while they're partaking in a sacred meal, offering a prayer of thanksgiving over the bread, so much like a traditional Eucharist, right? But instead of joining them, Jesus laughs at them. The source points out that in this particular Gnostic text, Jesus is frequently depicted actively mocking traditional expressions of worship. Now, what's really interesting about this is the meaning behind that laughter. According to the source's analysis, the Gnostics wrote this to show that the traditional disciples are entirely mistaken. They are foolishly worshiping the ignorant creator God who made the physical bread and the physical universe. In this inverted text, the only disciple who actually possesses the true secret gnosis, the only one who truly gets the joke, is Judas. Section 5, Modern Pop Culture, Ancient Lies Today. While all of this might sound like ancient history, our source makes a very provocative argument. These ancient beliefs are not dead. In fact, they argue these ideas are actively pushed in today's media landscape. Let's look at the modern connections. The source lists several modern examples where this Gnostic philosophy is supposedly thriving right now. They point to literature like Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, which famously popularizes alternative hidden narratives about Christ. They argue that a lot of Hollywood films push narratives that echo the idea of escaping a fake physical reality crafted by some malevolent force. And they even point to specific corners of the internet, like a youth-targeted website called enemies.com, arguing that these are literally just modern resurrections of that exact same ancient lie from the Garden of Eden. To illustrate this, the source describes some pretty startling imagery found on that website, enemies.com. They detail an animation where an image of the crucified Christ splits completely in half, and a serpent emerges from within him. The source links this intense imagery to virulent anti-Christian movements that draw on the occultist Aleister Crowley. They suggest that this modern incarnation uses intense emotion to ultimately redirect worship away from God and toward the serpent, or Satan. Section 6. Biblical Defense, Refuting Gnosticism. Having laid out the Gnostic inversion from ancient texts all the way to modern media, the source then turns to its counterargument. Let's look at the specific biblical defenses the source relies on to explicitly refute Gnosticism. The source invokes several key scriptures to classify Gnostic teachings as inherently deceptive and, well, fundamentally satanic. They point to Revelation 12:9, which explicitly identifies the ancient serpent not as a savior, but as the devil. They point back to the original warnings in Genesis 3, and crucially, they look at the historical timeline, noting that the Apostle Paul was actually already fighting these inverted ideas in his letters to Timothy, long before the major Gnostic Gospels were even written down. So the crucial point is found here in 1 Timothy 6:20. When Paul tells Timothy to avoid the opposing arguments of what is falsely called knowledge, the original Greek word Paul uses there is gnosis. The source argues this is a direct, explicit warning to the early church against these exact esoteric, inverted doctrines that claim to offer secret enlightenment. The source frames their final scriptural warning around 2 Thessalonians. The passage warns of a strong delusion sent upon those who don't love the truth, leading them to believe what is false. For the source, this is really the ultimate culmination of the argument against Gnosticism, that the inverted hermeneutic, making the creator the villain and the serpent the hero, is the exact deluding influence the biblical authors were warning humanity about. Which brings us to a really compelling final thought based on our source's analysis. When we watch movies or read books that completely flip traditional morality on its head, are we just consuming harmless entertainment? Or are we witnessing a highly sophisticated revival of ancient Gnostic inverted hermeneutics, subtly encouraging us to view the entire world through that exact same upside-down lens? It's definitely a fascinating question to consider the next time you encounter a story where the ancient villains are suddenly framed as the misunderstood heroes. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you see.